Dianna, welcome. I'm Cory with Great Lakes Proud. This is Byron, and we just decided that we would reach out to you, get some insight because you are the lighthouse expert in Michigan for coming National Lighthouse Day, which is August 7th. And you have actually written the actual book on Michigan lighthouses, correct?
Well, I've written one of them. There are quite a few of them out there, but mine tells a little bit of a spookier side of them, so I think it kind of stands out from the others.
Oh, I like it. And what's the name of the book?
It is Michigan's Haunted Lighthouses, and it came out in 2019 from the History Press. That was actually my first book. And then last year, I published one that was a little bit broader into the Great Lakes region called Death and Lighthouses on the Great Lakes. And that kind of takes true crime, murder, suicide, and the dark side, and the history of lighthouses. And so they're both kind of dark. But that seems to be a popular thing right now. People are really into those genres of spooky, true crime, murder mystery kind of things. And these books definitely fit those categories.
That's awesome. Yeah, I feel like the true crime kind of podcast scene and all that stuff is absolutely massive right now. So why Lighthouse? There has to be a backstory on why somebody wakes up and decides, you know what, I'm not only lighthouse books, but like spooky, scary, paranormal type of stuff around lighthouses. Like there has to be a backstory into why you got into lighthouses.
Well, I grew up in Southwest Michigan. I grew up in Allegan County and lived probably 45 minutes from Lake Michigan. And I would go to the lake occasionally as a kid, and I'm sure I saw lighthouses there. But it wasn't until the late 90s, I was actually working in Grand Rapids for an organization called the West Michigan Tourist Association. And we were publishing a magazine called the Lake Michigan Circle Tour Guide. And it kind of talked about all the cool things to do all around Lake Michigan on that 1,100-mile route. And my first project with that was to identify where all the lights were and catalog them in a spreadsheet with, the name of the light, what city it was in, how tall it was. Could you climb the tower? Did they have a museum? Did they have a gift shop? Could you spend the night? Like all of this stuff. And I remember that one of the columns in that was it haunted? Like, was there a ghost story? And
Okay.
so back at the beginning, I was just like putting checks in boxes and, filling it in. And this was early days of really the internet. And so when I was gathering information, I was actually calling museums and libraries or going to visit them to get information. And I started hearing some of these ghost stories, and I just got interested in those, and not just the stories, but then kind of the backstory of the lighthouse keeper, because in most cases, these lights are haunted by former keepers or members of their family. And my dad's a historian and a genealogist, and my daughter has been seeing ghosts since she was a little kid. So I kind of had all of this in my wheelhouse, and it just kept growing from that. So in my 7 years at West Michigan Tourist, working on that publication and digging into the history, I created a presentation for libraries called Michigan's Ghostly Beacons, which talked a lot about these stories. And I would travel all over the state. And then in 2017, I got an email from the History Press, and they're actually based down in South Carolina. And they had Googled the topic of Michigan haunted lighthouses. And I guess my name started popping up everywhere because I'd written articles or I'd given presentations and whatever. And so they sent me an email, and they have this Spooky America series, which is all about haunted stuff. And it's wildly popular across the country. And they said anything they did that involved lighthouses also sold really well. So they thought if they took a book about Michigan lighthouses that are haunted, it would just be a bestseller. So they asked if I would be interested in writing that for them. And I thought about it for a while because, doing an article is 3,000 words maximum, usually, sometimes 800 words. Writing a 40,000 word book and gathering all of the historical research and the photos and everything, that was a bigger task. And so I really had to think about if I had the time to commit to that. but I finally dove in, and the book came out in March of 19, and the initial 1,000 print run was sold out in 3 weeks. So it actually, ironically, came out the week of the Pure Michigan Tourism Conference in Traverse City. And so I got the shipment like the day before the conference, and I rolled into that conference with a bag full of books, and um, was selling them to a lot of my friends in the tourism industry right there in Traverse City. So the timing on it all just came together really, really well. And you know, that's just, one element, the haunted stuff. I talk a lot about library programs, and I speak probably 50 times a year at libraries. And a lot of it is haunted stuff, but I also talk about a lot of our female lighthouse keepers. Michigan had 50 women over the years who served in various capacities at the lighthouse. And that is just super inspiring to me, to think about government jobs in the 1800s where women worked side by side with men, a couple times were the boss of men, and they got paid the same as men.
Oh, wow.
Which isn't that incredible? Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know what happened along the way, how that changed. But you look at some of these women and their stories, and a couple of them have been written memoirs or autobiographies, and it's just so inspiring to see, and to see the level of support that they were getting from their male counterparts at neighboring lighthouses. And so, the lighthouses, we look at them, and I know you guys can see probably lighthouses pretty regularly when you live near the lakeshore. They're very beautiful, but they didn't operate without these people, and it was their stories that really just resonate with me. My dad's a genealogist, as I mentioned, and so since he never found me a lighthouse keeper in our family tree, I find that I have to research the family tree of all these other lighthouse keepers. And it's just such a unique job that we don't have around anymore. It was a physically demanding job, mentally, emotionally. They lived in remote areas. You think about now driving out to Northport to the Grand Traverse Lighthouse, and it's a a winding kind of rural road. Imagine what that was like in the 1850s. You had to take a horse and carriage. It was really remote back then.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, these stories and the histories of the lights and the buildings and the families that helped the keeper out, and in Michigan, I think it's just so much more important for us here because we have more lighthouses than any other state. Got 129. So I'm looking at that map there behind Byron, and yeah, there are dots all over the Great Lakes, but the bulk of those are right there on Michigan's shoreline. And so National Lighthouse Day, which is celebrated throughout the country, is of particular interest to me here in Michigan because, we are the lighthouse state, in my opinion.
I love that. Is it random question, is your next book going to be all about Michigan women lighthouse keepers? Because I feel like if there was a next book, that has to be it. I feel like you seem so inspired by it, and it is such a cool story. That would be, I think that would be awesome, or at least an article. Maybe not the history of the book. That sounds.
Yeah. I mean, I still speak on it quite a bit. In fact, I gave a presentation, a couple of them just this month. And there is a book out that came out just in the last few years called Ladies of the Lights. And it was written by a woman named Pat Major. And Pat used to run the Michigan Women's Hall of Fame down in Lansing. And I met her because they were doing an exhibit on female keepers, and she asked me to kind of help out, and I gave a presentation, and she was working on her book at the time. And so I actually shared a lot of my information with her. And so she wrote the book on it, and it's a wonderful book. And there are several of them out there about female lighthouse keepers. And even a couple, like I said, a couple memoirs, one of particular note. There was this woman who tended the light on Beaver Island after her husband died, and her name was Elizabeth Whitney. Elizabeth Whitney Van Riper at the time, and then she got remarried. But she served there and at the Little Traverse Light in Harbor Springs, and she served for 44 years. The longest serving woman in the lighthouse industry. She retired at the age of 69 and then lived like another 25 years after that. She In 1905, she wrote her autobiography. And I had a chance to read it just recently. I actually own a first edition of it, which is my most coveted book. And it's a lovely read. It's almost like, if Little House on the Prairie occurred in the Great Lakes at a lighthouse. It's a lot of this early pioneer stories. It talks about her being born on Mackinac Island, living on St. Helena Island, how they ended up on Beaver Island. She lived for a brief time in Traverse City because when she was on Beaver Island, it was during the reign of King James Strang, who was the king of the Mormons on Beaver Island. And it was a really dangerous time for the family to be there. And she talks about that. In fact, the subtitle of her book is Life Among Mormons. But she digs into her whole life, and it just at the very end talks about serving as a lighthouse keeper and how she had lost her husband during a rescue attempt in a shipwreck. Her mother had lost her first husband. She lost 2 half-brothers. I think she lost a couple nephews, all to shipwrecks in the Great Lakes. And it was that really motivated her to become a lighthouse keeper, because she wanted to be the one to keep the light going, to protect the shoreline, to give that beacon of hope to people out on the water, particularly during stormy seasons, to get them to safety, and to also to help make sure that other families didn't have to go through the heartbreak that she did, losing her husband during a shipwreck. And so she took it on for humanity's sake, and she did it as a calling to serve and protect. And the stories that she tells are just, and she's so eloquent in the way she writes. And so when I talk about the Ladies of the Lights, I give my presentation, and I have one just on her. In fact, I've done a deep dive into her family history. I read parts of her book because she says it so much better than if I just, regurgitate what she's written. And she, to me, is such an inspiring person. She served from the late 20s, lost a husband, served until she was almost 70 years old, saved her money, and then bought her and her husband their retirement home in Charlevoix. She bought their house. It was amazing. And I sometimes think about what it would be like to meet her, like what it would have been like to know her.
Like one of those questions where it's like, like if you go to lunch with like a famous person and a dead person,
right?
Yeah. So
the amount of sorry, go ahead, Cory.
So basically, I was going to ask, you said she made it her mission to keep the light on, and I think I want you to talk about why did we need lighthouses? Obviously, this lady lost a bunch of her family to shipwrecks. Obviously, I know it probably helps with shipping, but I don't think that me as a person, can't you just flip the light switch on? It's a light.
And like you mentioned, Diana, we see it. We see lighthouses all the time where we live along the lakeshore, and we see them as beautiful. We see them as a beautiful piece of history. But if you really look back at the operation of the lighthouse, there was, and you talk about the amount of work that was involved, and then you talk about. Yeah. You talk about, weathering the storm. They had to weather the storm. They were in the lighthouse. They were at the lighthouse. They were most needed in the worst of weather. Right.
Absolutely.
And, now we see these, beautiful structures. And, we love to look at them, but there was one point in time where they were a necessity. They were much more than just a tourist attraction. I mean, they're tourist attractions now, whereas, they were a very, very functional and critical piece of navigating the waterways. And I can't even imagine, the work that it must have taken to operate these things and their purpose.
Exactly. So if we go back to the early history of lighthouses in Michigan, our first lighthouse, which was built in 1825, is Fort Gratiot, which is in Port Huron, still active. Built in 1825. Michigan didn't even become a state until 1837. So this is a dozen years before statehood. And, you started to see an increase in the lighthouses. I know we had one in the Straits of Mackinac in the 1830s. They were built to protect the shoreline, to serve as that navigational aid. We take it for granted now because we have GPS on our phone, we have GPS in our boats. We have all of this other technology that makes them not a necessary aid anymore. But when they were first being built, Michigan had early industries. We had in the UP, when we would see the lights show up, you had mining going on. And so then after they would extract things from the ground, they would have to transport that stuff. And so they would have to put it on a ship, and it would travel or on a train in early years. But they would have to send that stuff by ship. So you have industries like the mining industry, the logging industry, the fishing industry, the agricultural industry. So as we're starting to realize, this Lake Michigan shoreline is really great for growing fruits and vegetables. Well, that's great, but how are you going to get those to market in Chicago and Detroit? You have to put them on a ship. And then you started to see in the late 1800s, tourists were coming in, and you had these massive steamships that would come in again from Chicago and Detroit, bringing people in to spend their vacations in northern Michigan. And so these lighthouses protected all of that. And, shipping seasons in Michigan at the time for industry started usually around April or May, depending on the season. Obviously, Lake Superior would get a start a little bit later than Lake Michigan, Lake Huron. And then it would run until November, maybe December, depending on the weather. But you look at those lighthouses, and I'm going to use one of the most obvious examples here, which was in modern time, which was the Edmund Fitzgerald. It went down in 1975. But you notice in the song, they almost made Whitefish Point. And the power was out at Whitefish Point, so it wouldn't have really mattered. But it was, it was there, and in stormy weather, those ships counted on that light to know where they had to go. Or in some cases, like Waugoshance, which is actually in a state of ruins up near Mackinac, it's built in this really shallow, rocky part of the shoreline. And it was built there to warn ships to stay away from this area. So these ships' captains, they had to know more than just how to drive, I don't know, yes, their vessels, whether it was an old schooner, whether it was a freighter, whatever it was. But they also had to know what each light meant. And they had to know by looking during the day over at the shoreline. And if they saw a tall lighthouse that was black and white banded, they would know that that's Big Sobble in Ludington, because it was the only lighthouse that had that distinguishable day mark. If they're traveling up the shoreline at night, they would have to be able to look over and see the light pattern. And every light had a different pattern, whether it was the color of the light or how many seconds it was on and off.
I was about to ask that question.
Like how to know
different
what
lights
it was.
Had different. You could tell which light you were at, or if was visible by a pattern or a color.
Yeah, right. So let's say it's a red light, and the distinction is 3 seconds on, 1 second off, 3 seconds on, 1 second off. That they would have a logbook or a book, and then they would know, that is light whatever. Beaver Island has a red light over there. There's an interesting story actually from the 90s over on Lake Huron at the old Presqu'île Lighthouse, which is kind of in the Alpena area. And this light, I remember seeing a documentary about it back in the 90s, but this light was deactivated. In fact, had no power running to it. The lens in the top, the Fresnel lens, was gone. Yet ships traveling through that area and people in town at the marina reported the light shining. And that was not a good thing. And because if you put an extra light into the rotation, those ship captains know, oh, 7 lights past Tawas Point Lighthouse is this lighthouse, and you throw an extra light in the mix, they're going to think they're somewhere they're not.
Yeah.
And they had to go around and try to debunk why they thought this light, like they would cover the glass. They thought maybe it was reflecting off the glass of the tower. And they put like wool blankets around the outside, those heavy wool army blankets, thinking nothing would be able to reflect off of it, and they would still see the light shining. And it's obviously a haunted light, right? It's in the book. You can read more.
Right.
But you know, you can't put an extra light in where it doesn't belong, because it can throw off the whole dynamic of you know, at least at that time period of what was going on. But so lighthouse keepers, they worked their tails off. You had to climb the tower every day. You had to carry oil up there. You had to trim the wick. If you're burning with whale oil, lard, or kerosene, it creates soot. So every day they're polishing that Fresnel lens. Inside the lens, all of the different crystal parts of it, they have to polish the glass in the tower inside and out. They have to clean the house all the time. In fact, they could have surprise inspections. The inspector could show up, white glove on, and, you know, wipe his hand along the desk. And if there was dust there, they would get demerits for that. The family had to keep up the grounds. They had to have flower gardens. Often they had farms and animals and vegetable gardens to help feed the families. They had to have active logbooks. And so a lot of times that's why you see families really stepping up and helping out, because if for some reason, if one of the lighthouse keepers was sick or injured, or maybe had to go out of town on another business, there's no just like putting a close sign on the lighthouse and saying it's not going to operate for the day. You know, it has to go and shine every single day. And so the family would have to step up, because if they didn't, that keeper would lose his job. And then he would lose his salary, which was like $500 a year, not a huge amount. They would lose their house. And chances are they're going to get blacklisted and not get another job because they failed to keep the light going. So you see a lot of the families, and I think that's how a lot of the women became so well trained in the job, is because they were there helping their husbands in a lot of those
system to help you kind of manage it. Yeah, I don't think. Yeah. You know, I mean, yeah, that's a 24/7, you know,
it is.
It's, you know, Christmas or New Year, or, you know.
Can you imagine?
Doesn't matter.
It was Elizabeth Williams, right? That did that job, did all for 45 years.
Yeah, by herself. She never had an assistant.
45 years of that. That's incredible.
And you know, the 2 lights she worked at were easily managed lights. They weren't particularly big. You think about it, I don't know if you guys have been out to South Manitou. It's 117 steps to the top of that tower every single day.
Well, yeah,
several times a day.
And you're literally like in complete isolation.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, there's nowhere to, like, you know, we talk about how far and how you know, windy and that trip up to Grand Traverse Lighthouse must have been in Northport. But when you're on South Manitou Island,
you're there.
You're there. You're not anywhere.
Now, they did have quite a population back there, actually, in the 1860s and 70s. They had like 200 people living out there. So they did have a lot of the family. In fact, one of the interesting stories about that light, Aaron Sheridan was one of the keepers. He was a Civil War soldier. A lot of soldiers, veterans, got jobs as lighthouse keepers, ironically. He lost the use of his arm in battle. So he was a one-armed lighthouse keeper and had to climb up that tower, carrying that pail of hot oil and take care of that light. His wife, Julia, was recognized as one of the female keepers. And then they had 6 sons. And so I think some of the older sons, as they got into their teenage years, would help out as well. And as challenging as that sounds, we had another keeper down in South Haven. His name was James Donahue, and he was a one-legged lighthouse keeper. He walked on a peg leg.
Oh my goodness.
And can you imagine? I have trouble going up spiral stairs with 2 good legs, let alone on a peg leg. Isn't that crazy? But he was there for 45 years.
Wow.
all at the same lighthouse.
So
And
if she was, if she did that for 45 years, and you're talking, he did it, his career was 45 years. Is there an average, like what is the average career of a lighthouse keeper? What, is there an average number of years that each, maybe lighthouse keeper had that role? Or I guess, who was the longest running lighthouse keeper?
I would say that if you're getting into the 40s, you're a long-standing keeper. Probably a lot of them were more in the 20 to 30 range.
Okay.
And then we have a handful of them, like particularly some of the wives would come in and they were only there until they could find a better replacement for them. But Elizabeth and Captain Donahue were two of the longest serving. I'm trying to think if I don't think anybody was really beyond 45 years. Yeah, I think, we lost a lot. I mean, the Sheridans on South Manitou, they were only there for about 10 years and they both died in a shipwreck coming back from, they had gone in a boat from the island over to Glen Haven or Glen Arbor, one of the two. And on the return trip, the boat capsized right at the entrance to the harbor and they were lost at sea that day. They were in the boat in March in a sailboat. Can you imagine that?
Like their life was devoted to protecting ships and ensuring the safety of the boaters and those passing by the island, and
then the irony of them dying that way.
Wow.
Yeah,
that's crazy.
There were a lot of it, there was a lot of that because it was just it was a different time period. Boats were much different, and they didn't have weather prediction systems like we do now. Although when a squall, as a squall can blow up off the lake at any point and cause havoc. And, I see stories in the news regularly. I Google alerts about boating accidents. I mean, how many people are hitting the pier in Chicago on a regular basis? Now, those are mostly alcohol related, but there are still a fair number of shipwrecks and accidents out there. And it was dangerous, but they were in charge of keeping that light lit, and in many cases in charge of life-saving operations as well, especially if there was no life-saving station at the same place. Now, South Manitou had both. And despite that, no one could get out to Aaron and Julia the day that they died. Sadly, they also had their youngest child with them, and he was only 9 months old. So he died that day as well. And it is a lot. There's a lot of tragedy involved, and it was dangerous for these folks, but they did it. They, just like a firefighter or a police officer today, they see it as more than just a job. It's their calling.
Sure.
And I think that's what really draws me in, are these stories of that for them.
Wow. That's great. I think you are an absolute wealth of knowledge on this, and like recalling keepers' names and where they were at and like their stories and the histories and stuff like that. I feel like it takes a person with true passion to really be able to like sink in and like gather all that information and be able to just recall it. So this has been amazing.
Well, I have been telling these stories for 25 years, so
well, that probably helps.
Yeah, and they're all second nature to me. I mean, that's why when I wrote my first book, it was really kind of easy because these stories, I get to pick which stories and which photos, and these were stories I could have wrote that book in my sleep.
Yeah.
Because I knew it so well. The second book, I actually kind of enjoyed researching and writing a little bit more because I've been so focused on Michigan for so long that I never really thought about the lights outside the rest of the Great Lakes. And so I learned a lot in doing that research because there's several, I think there's 5 lights in that book that are in Canada. and there's one in Wisconsin, one in Illinois, one in Ohio. And so I got to go visit lights that I hadn't been to before, or do new research, or really dig into stuff that was totally new for me. And that research part is really, I mean, that's what I thrive on. I mean, I love to write and I love to give my presentations, but I've been doing research and historical research since I was in elementary school. My dad dragged us to Gettysburg, and we spent all this time in libraries and town halls and feeding dimes into microfilm machines and all this. And I think I hated it at the time, but when I started working on the books, all of those memories of those experiences came back to me. And so in preparing for the second book, I just like, it was so interesting to hear stories or to pick up new information. And of course, then you get that whole murder mystery kind of thing, which adds to and they're all unsolved, by the way. Nobody in any of the stories in that book, nobody was ever charged and or convicted of any of the crimes.
They're all cold cases, all open
They're all
cases.
cold. They're going to stay cold cases, because I don't think you're going to solve, the dismemberment and murder of the lighthouse keeper at Toronto Island from the early 1800s. I mean, we're 200 years past that. I think all of the evidence is gone.
New evidence is going to come out for that.
Yeah, I don't think anything new is going to come out on that. But it's super fascinating. And it was also fascinating that the newspapers were covering these things back then. So when you go to newspapers.com and you're pulling up all this great research and newspaper articles about shipwrecks and murders and all this other stuff, that to me was super fascinating as well. So
I have a couple of rapid fire questions, and then I want to get to how people like me or anybody watching this can kind of help lighthouse culture, help lighthouses in general, like in the modern era. So my first question is probably going to be the hardest, and that is, do you have a favorite?
Do not ask me what my favorite lighthouse is.
I figured I would try. I'm sure it's impossible.
So it's like if you have a child and you have to pick your favorite.
Yeah.
I mean,
which means what she's saying is she secretly has a favorite lighthouse. She just
I mean, I love them all. There are certain ones that I love. I mean, I'd happily tell you my favorite lighthouse keeper. That's easier, and that's Elizabeth Whitney Williams. But I think probably South Manitou would be one of my favorites, because for a couple reasons. One is, over the years, I've got to know members of the Sheridan family. And they've provided me with a lot of research and photos. And so I think when you can find that personal connection to that lighthouse, that kind of helps. And a few years ago, gosh, more than a few years ago, almost 20 years ago now, I was a guest of the national parks and the Manitou Memorial Society, which kind of manages the historic sites on the two islands. And I had given a presentation in Empire, and the next day was the first time I went out to South Manitou, and they put me up in the Coast Guard station. So I actually got to spend the night, 2 nights in the Coast Guard building. And when the boat went back at 4:00 with all the day trippers, they gave me the key to the lighthouse and said, just lock it up when you're done. Oh, wow. And it's haunted, so I was out there. Actually, that was probably the first investigation I kind of did, was out there. And so I remember, ironically, the anniversary of that was July 30th of that year, because I remember it was my daughter's birthday, and I got in trouble from her by being out there on the island and not with her. So I was up there. It was July 30th. There was a blue moon that night, so the second full moon of the month. And I thought, if any time a ghost is going to come and make its presence known, this is going to be the night, right?
100%. Yep.
It did not. And I tried, but I got to see the sun go down from the top of the tower. Is just it's just magical. So you see the sun go down, you see the blue moon come out, and in between those things, you're watching freighters go by and other boats. And it just was, it was just kind of magical. And that's actually been the only time I've climbed that tower. I've been to the island a couple times over the years, but I think that experience really solidified that particular light in my heart. So
I love that. Yeah, that
What an
would.
incredible experience to be able to have.
Yeah, and that was back before we had the phones that took the pictures. So like I got no pictures of it.
Oh, I thought you were gonna say you had a bunch of Polaroids or something.
No, or I wish I'd have thought, I don't even know if I had a camera back then. I don't even know if I do have pictures. I have no idea where they are, but they're in my head. I have memories of it. I guess that's going to have to suffice.
Okay, so next question. Is there a lighthouse hotspot in Michigan? Is there like a particular city or location where maybe it's just the concentration of lighthouses or multiple historic or just anything where like if you were really big in, I guess if you were really big into lighthouses, you would already know this, but if you wanted to be big into lighthouses, where are you road tripping to like get the most bang for your buck?
Straits of Mackinac.
Okay.
So there are 20 lighthouses within the Straits area. Some of them on the mainland. So in Mackinac City, you've got Old Mackinac Point, which sits right there next to the bridge. And then a couple miles away on the other side of the bridge is McGulpin Point Lighthouse. And those are both open for tours. So Great Lakes Lighthouse Keepers Association, which is based in Mackinac City, they do certain day trips out to St. Helena Island, which is, if you're going north over the bridge, you can see the island off to the west, and you can sometimes see what looks just like a little matchstick, which is the lighthouse on the south end of the island. And so you can go out and they do tours, day trips out there. But Shepler's Ferry does east and west cruises throughout the summer. And then I think they still do, they do tours up the St. Mary's River up to Sault Ste. Marie. And there are a couple of lights along that route as well. So if you really want to check off a lot of lighthouses, you have a lot of different options by taking those cruises. But there's a couple of lights in that area also. Detour Reef, which is in northern Lake Huron, and White Shoal, which is in northern Lake Michigan. They both have keeper programs where you can volunteer. They're in a state of restoration. So you volunteer. It's kind of like if you would do a Habitat for Humanity kind of thing. You go out there for a week and you're helping scrape paint and fix windows and do all this other stuff. So there are different levels of access to lighthouses. You can go and tour them as a museum. You can go and do some work. This is more hands-on work. Both Grand Traverse Lighthouse and Mission Point Lighthouse there in Traverse City have volunteer keeper programs where you're there and you stay on site and you're running the gift shop and helping with other tourist type stuff. And if you're like me and you just want to go and stay and do nothing but lay around, eat, drink, and read, then there's only one lighthouse bed and breakfast in Michigan, and that's Big Bay Point, which is up northwest of Marquette, and currently the only B&B in Michigan. Yeah, it's haunted, so just be prepared that you're going to be sleeping with ghosts.
I think I can do that.
That sounds fun. Yeah.
Yeah, don't read the ghost stories before bed, because the one time I stayed there, that's what I did, and I didn't really sleep.
I can't imagine.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Byron.
Of the 129 lighthouses, well, it's 129 still active in Michigan, correct?
Well, there's 129 lights. Not all of them are active.
Okay, so of the 129 lights in Michigan, how many of you had the opportunity to visit or see, whether from the water or from land? And are there any that you haven't yet been to that you would like to visit or get to know more about?
Yeah, actually, a couple of years ago, I'm actually going to bring it up while I'm talking to you. I actually started a Google sheet of it because I couldn't remember. Like, I didn't know exactly. So my lighthouse list, and it has like a list of which ones I viewed. Some of them I've been from the water and some I've actually gone through. And I have 129 on this list. Let me sort them and see how many sort by column. Let's do column C, which how many of them I have entered. I've only entered 26 of them. That's sad. And in terms of those that I have viewed, I have viewed 70 of them. But A lot of them are remote. And like I've tried in some of these others, we've tried to see. So Boblo Island in northern Lake Michigan, which is south of Mackinac, they have a lighthouse on the east side of the island, and we tried one year to get to it, but it was all 2-track, and we had too big of a vehicle to get down there. So I had a permission, but we just never got there. There's one called, I think it's 14 Mile Point, which is up on Lake Superior. It's in ruins. You got to get to that by water. There are a couple of the other island lights that I have not gotten out to, particularly up in Lake Superior. Grand Island, which is out of Munising, they have a light on the north end of the island. We had permission to go to that one, but it was like an 8-mile hike each way, and I didn't really have the motivation to do that. So some of those I just haven't gotten to, but there's a couple I'm pretty embarrassed that I haven't seen, like super easy ones like Grand Haven. And what's another really easy one that I haven't been to? The little Sable Point Lighthouse in Mears, which is super easy to get to. I have no idea why I haven't gotten to those, but I'm going to be passing by Mears next weekend, so maybe I'll zip in. And it'll be actually on National Lighthouse Day. It's going to be on Monday, so maybe
you've got to then. I mean, and then you'll need to update us once you visit. Let us know. Was it?
I'll send you a selfie from it.
Perfect.
Yeah. So it's interesting because there's a big stretch of some in the on Lake Huron that I haven't been to. But I'm embarrassed that I haven't been to all of them. That's kind of sad.
That ties into my last question was basically like, are there any hidden gem lighthouses or lighthouses that are hard to get to? And so I feel like you kind of definitely did that. I think I've seen doing like the tours like on the Grand Island and like Munising. I've seen the lighthouse. Yeah. I didn't know there was one that you could get on the island and then go. You have to hike 8 miles and then get to another lighthouse. I just assumed they just had.
Well, yeah, and that one that is not public. We had private permission to go to that one. So if you hike 8 miles out, you're going to probably be turned away and have to hike all the way back without seeing the light.
Oh wow!
It's owned. It's privately owned, and I had happened to, because it's in my second book. Because 2 lighthouse keepers disappeared from there in the early 1900s and were found mutilated later. But that's another story. And so we had permission to go out there from the actual owner, and so you'd have to make those special arrangements. I don't want you getting like shot at or anything. I don't know what's 2 separate.
That I'll call you, and then maybe you could get a recommendation.
Put you in touch with Mr. Graham.
It's like, I know we're limited on time here, but I feel like I could just spend all day talking to you more about lighthouses. Like
now I want to have a whole other thing just about the theory of why so much bad stuff is happening to all of these keepers, and why is it? Because it's not just like, oh, they got robbed. And I think that was the second time that you said a lighthouse keeper got cut up, and it was 2 of them. So that's the 3rd time, And so you just think like, why are like, it just sounds so gruesome. Like, what was it?
This could be its own series of just unsolved mysteries of
of the lighthouses. Well, you need to read my book.
I do.
You'll get all the details in there.
I'm sorry to say I haven't read it yet, but I need to get a copy. And speaking of that, Dianna, where can we get your book? Where's the best place to buy a copy of your book?
So if you go to my website, which is promotemichigan.com, you can order my books there, and they do come autographed and personalized if you'd like them. So I always encourage people to do that. If not, it's available online or at local bookstores. So I know there locally that Horizon Books has had it. In fact, I did a book signing for the first book there. I go through bookstores, and sometimes if I see my book, I get them all off the shelf, and I walk up to the counter and go like, this is my book. Would you like me to sign it? And then I carry these little stickers that I put on the front of them. So that's always a good sign. I know that it's really easy for people to go to certain online discount websites to purchase books. And I would just like to put a little PSA here in that when you do that, the local author gets less than $1 per book and a royalty. So it's always best if you can buy directly from the author. Secondly, would be to buy from a local brick and mortar store. And they can often order it for you, even if you can't, if they don't have it, because at least then you're supporting a local business and local employees. And businesses that then turn around and sponsor local soccer teams or contribute to local concert series or whatever. So I try to tell people, shop local. And ironically, next week, while Michigan Lighthouse Day falls on August 7th, is also, I think, part of Buy Michigan Week. So, trying to encourage people to support local. You guys wouldn't like it if people went and bought T-shirts out of China that had Michigan on it, right? You want them supporting local. And speaking of which, I hear you guys have a T-shirt I need to add. Maybe we should swap. I'll send you a book and you can send me a T-shirt.
Yeah, let's make that happen.
Yeah, we are doing Milliken Harbor in Detroit. It's managed by Belle Isle, and so it's a little tiny harbor, little tiny state park. But part of our thing through Great Lakes Proud and doing the DNR Parks and Rec program for merchandise is we're profiling about half a dozen parks that we're getting ready to launch in the next month. And Belle Isle and Milliken Harbor, which has a lighthouse, is one of them. So we were coming out with a lighthouse sticker and a lighthouse T-shirt, and we would love to send you one, and we would love to have some of your books for sure.
And then I'll take a picture of me with my shirt on, and then you guys can take pictures of you with my books.
Done.
And then
done and done. We can definitely make that work. So
it's all about collaboration.
It really is. So lastly, before we wrap things up, is there where should we go to learn about lighthouse stuff, help out? You were talking about like the volunteer keeper programs. Is there a place that we can just go? Is every lighthouse managed differently?
All of the above. So a lot of the lighthouses are part of the state park system in Michigan. So if you go to michigan.gov, you can find details about a lot of the various lighthouses that way. Also through Pure Michigan, through the michigan.org. But the highest concentration of information is found on two websites. And these are sites that I use a lot when I do research for books or articles or presentations. One is the Great Lakes Lighthouse Keepers Association. They're based in Mackinac City. So it's GLLKA. So the abbreviation for Great Lakes Lighthouse Keepers Association.org. And that's where you can find the map of all the lights that has the list of all the keeper programs, the bed and breakfast, and they update it. So we used to have 3 B&B lighthouses, and now there's only one. Well, if one of them gets reopened, they'll update the website. So that's a great source. And then there was a gentleman by the name of Terry Pepper, and he was the president of the organization for many years. He passed away in February of 19. But he, over the years, had amassed this amazing website called terrypepper.com, just like it sounds. And each Great Lake has a page in every lighthouse, or almost every lighthouse, has a page with like as much as 12 pages if you printed it off. All the information about how it was built and how much it costs, and early renderings and photographs and keeper images. It has lists of all the keepers from each of those lighthouses. And when I give my presentations, a lot of people come out and say, hey, my great, great, great grandfather was a lighthouse keeper. Do you know anything about him at this light? And I automatically send them to that website. Say, start there, see if he's on that list, and then go from there to track down information. So those two websites are the best. And anytime I give my lighthouse programs, I put them up on a screen at the end of the program, and everybody gets their phones out to take pictures so that they can remember to go back to those and look at those websites at a later date.
Awesome. Well, I definitely think we need to do version 2. Be like a murder mystery podcast, because I really want to get your thoughts on some of the stuff that we've already talked about that we didn't have time to go into. I think that would just be amazing. I mean, even just for me personally, I just think it would be fun to talk about.
Well, we could talk about all kinds of things. So I have a whole wealth of information on other haunted places that aren't necessarily lighthouses. And I have a ton of information on the history of agriculture in Michigan. And if you go to my website, I have a list of all the other programs that I give, and I do a lot of research on other random historical things. So maybe we'll do something in October on just general haunted places, like places that you can stay or eat, or, you know, things like that. Go on and do a seance or other fun stuff. I mean, I get geeked about that stuff.
Great Lakes Ghost Stories.
There we go.
Yeah, brand new series.
Well, we won't keep you much longer. Dianna, thank you so much for your time today. To find out more about awesome stuff going on in the state of Michigan, or to get Dianna's books, Michigan's Haunted Lighthouses and Death in Lighthouses on the Great Lakes, be sure to visit promotemichigan.com.